This week on Just Solutions, the UN climate talks that took place in Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt ended with an agreement to create a loss and damage fund for vulnerable countries who are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. But the conference failed to deliver significant emission reductions. Our guest today is Rachel Cleetus, who's the Policy Director with the Climate and Energy Programme at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Ahead of the COP conference, Cleetus asked if we can get off the highway to climate hell. So, what was achieved at COP27 and what was left out? From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Rachel, it's great to have you with us. Thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that reference to being on a highway to climate hell, that stems from an article that you wrote, and you were essentially quoting UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said, "We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator." So as we look at what was achieved, or maybe what didn't get done at COP27, I know that you wrote before the start of the conference that there were three things that you were looking at that would be a metric for success. One was increased ambition in emissions reduction commitments. Secondly, a renewed, scaled up climate finance pledges from richer countries. And number three was meaningful progress on addressing climate loss and damage. Let's dig into all three, and we'll start with the second one, because it does seem that was addressed with this fund that was created. Tell us a little bit about that, the Loss and Damage Fund.
Yeah, so we came into this COP at Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt with some really sobering scientific reports that had come out in the weeks before, showing that global carbon emissions continue to rise and hit record levels. And that, frankly, the science is showing that we're getting very close to the risk of blowing past the 1.5 degree goal that we know will have grave and profound consequences for people on the planet. So that was the context in which these negotiations started. And clearly, to address that climate crisis, we need to cut emissions as fast as possible. But to do that globally, there needs to be climate finance for low and middle income countries to also make a clean energy transition alongside richer nations. And frankly, richer nations are failing on both fronts. They're continuing to expand their fossil fuel infrastructure, and they're failing to provide the finance that is needed to make a global clean energy transition for countries to adapt to unavoidable climate impacts. Now at Sharm, we did finally, after 30 years, get agreement on a fund to address loss and damage. And loss and damage refers to that extreme part of climate impacts that are essentially impossible to adapt to through ordinary means. I'm talking about things like loss of land to sea level rise, which basically will forcibly displace millions of people around the world from their homes, from their livelihoods. That kind of a climate impact is already a reality in some places, and it's going to get worse in the decades to come. So this fund for loss and damage, getting this fund established is critical to address this challenge, and to address it in a way that acknowledges the inequity that we see in the world, which is that emissions have come primarily from richer countries, but they're imposing impacts on communities in many countries that have contributed very little to climate driving emissions. And so getting this fund was crucial. It was a litmus test for the success of this COP. That said, the fund is an empty fund for now. It has been created. There's a transitional committee that will help address the details to get it operational within the next year or two. But there isn't yet funding on the scale that will be necessary to actually address the problem.
And there's absolute massive need. If you look at the recent flooding in Pakistan, I think it was an estimated $30 billion were needed to help in that recovery process. That's just one particular incident. And we're seeing this all over the globe. But as you were saying, Rachel, when you were going into COP27, you were looking for climate finance pledges. But it seems from what you were saying there that that's also not just for loss and damage, but also to help transition into maybe cleaner energy, but also this new future that we're in. It's also adaptation as opposed to just dealing with the loss and the damage.
Yes, absolutely. So the climate finance that we need to grapple with is really for low and middle income countries to accelerate their clean energy transition. Across the world right now, the good news is that renewable energy is often the cheapest form of energy to install when you're thinking about new energy installations. So it is really a good news story in terms of the fact that it's already really gaining ground around the world. But we know, and the science shows, that we will not meet our climate goals unless we rapidly scale up the momentum that's already underway. We need billions of dollars in finance to help scale this up quickly in the time frame that we need to from a climate perspective. And that's what's been missing so far. Rich nations back in 2009, they committed that they would scale up their funding to $100 billion per year by 2020. They still have not met that mark. And meanwhile, the needs are growing exponentially. So there were some reports on the table ahead of COP pointing out the shortfall in funding so far and a preliminary plan for how to make up for that shortfall going forward. But what that requires is rich nations to actually go back home and implement policies to harness that money. And here in the United States, for example, we're in a fight right now in the end of the year budget process to make sure that climate finance is actually part of what the US government appropriates funding for. It is still not clear that that will happen. And if we don't get that finance right now, the US will fall short on its commitments on this front.
Well, the fund that was created, it didn't come easy. And maybe you can give us some insider details on what was actually playing out, because you were there at Sharm El Sheikh. That I think the COP27 itself extended for many hours, I believe 36 hours. There was such contentious debate about this. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't something that even was agreed upon easily. Take us through, what were some of the pushback? Who were the main players involved on all the different sides when it came to the creation of this fund?
Yeah, so just for some context, this fund has been a part of the conversation for 30 years now. You know, ever since the UNFCCC came to be, small island nations in particular who face existential threats from sea level rise have from the very beginning tried to call attention to this issue. And despite that, there's been real pushback from richer nations, including the United States and the countries that are part of the EU. Last year in Glasgow, this reached a fever pitch where it was just very, very clear that this was the number one request, the number one demand from developing countries, that this fund be established. And in Glasgow, that request was thwarted. And instead, there was a very watered down Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage that was agreed. This year, COP was held on the continent of Africa. Africa right now is, in the Horn of Africa, there are millions of people who are facing a multi-year prolonged drought that is in part because of climate change. Millions of people facing famine, many of them young children. Africa has also faced flooding events in this past year. They faced water shortages. It was just unthinkable that a COP could take place on this continent that is so climate vulnerable and that loss and damage not be addressed. So civil society and developing countries who are part of a group of negotiations called G77 plus China all really came into this COP saying this is the number one issue. And the Environment Minister of Pakistan, Sherry Rahman, led the G77 in that ask, very powerfully speaking to the floods in Pakistan that you mentioned earlier that have devastated the country, and pointing out how it affects everything. People lost lives, livelihoods. We saw cultural heritage sites being threatened, and this will have years of repercussions. The nation of Pakistan had its credit rating lowered as a result of this, which makes it even harder to come out of this challenge. And very little money has been put on the table compared to what's needed for them to come out. So in this context, the first week of COP was very United States and the EU nations to actually move off their intransigence and their red line around this. It was really hard to watch that so much time was wasted, and it came down right to the wire, right at the end, when we had gone into overtime, when there was finally an agreement. And that has two consequences. One, it really created a lot of trust has to be rebuilt now, because there was no reason to oppose this loss and damage fund and make it so hard to get. And all that time was wasted that could have also been spent on other important issues, like getting an agreement to phase down all fossil fuels. We did not get that agreement at the end of COP, and some of the time that was wasted on saying no to the loss and damage fund, that yes could have come early in the first week, and then we could have also addressed some of these other very pressing issues.
Well, the climate change minister of Pakistan said in response to the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund that it's not about accepting charity. In fact, what it is, it's essentially a down payment on the future and on climate justice. And I'd like to, pick up that phrase, climate justice, because what you were saying, Rachel, about the fact that this was held on the continent of Africa, and this is a continent that is so vulnerable and is living through, as you mentioned, there are several examples of the devastating impacts of the climate crisis. And yet we also know that many people from civil society advocacy groups were excluded, essentially, as we have seen in so many previous COPs. People are on the outside who are the real victims, essentially, of the climate crisis. They aren't the ones who have a seat at the table. Talk a little bit about that, about the people who weren't potentially at the decision-making tables, but who were there desperately trying to have their voices heard and their stories told.
Yeah, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem at these COPs. For example, at this COP, again, we had a record number of fossil fuel industry representatives at COP, precisely the opposite of who you want to be at the table when we're reaching these important agreements for addressing global climate change. And many, many people struggle to get badges that you need to enter the negotiating venue. They struggle to have the financial aid that would be needed to travel there and stay there. So yes, the equity of representation is really, really important from people from the global south, from indigenous communities, et cetera, who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, but are not just on the front lines of the crisis. They have solutions. They have really good ideas about what it would take to actually address this crisis in a just way. And that's why their voices are so important at the table. And even if not at the negotiating venue itself, the pressure from civil society all around the world on their policymakers is critical, so that we move in a direction that doesn't just speak to the current elite, those who are in power, those who have money, but really speaks to the needs of people, ordinary people around the world. This COP was especially fraught because of some of the human rights issues that were also very present in all our minds and in the background. And one of the very clear refrains from civil society was that we cannot separate climate justice from human rights. They're intrinsically connected. You can't get one without the other.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching. Join the conversation on social media, drop us a comment, but let us know your thoughts on COP27. Did you pay attention to what was going on? Was there indeed adequate coverage about what was happening, what was decided, what wasn't? We'd love to hear from you, so you can join the conversation. Rachel, the fact that there are always so many representatives from the oil and gas industry, from fossil fuel industries, showing up at these climate talks, that really resonated with me when you just mentioned that, because there's some breaking news coming out about a report that's just been issued by the House Oversight Committee saying that oil companies have been greenwashing their image while at the same time continuing, if not increasing, investment in fossil fuels. And so we're in this ridiculous scenario where they are being given access to the decision makers. They're showing up at these climate talk events as part of this whole greenwashing effort. And as you said, you have the people who are living through the worst impact of this being excluded, not even getting access into the halls where these decisions are being made. I mean, does the COP system even work at this point if scenario is playing out over and over?
On one hand, absolutely, everything that you're saying about the fossil fuel industry, its nefarious practices, its deep-funded, deceptive tactics to delay, obstruct climate policy, that's all very true. At the same time, I want people to know that we cannot give up on the UN system. And here's why. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and this negotiating process is the only venue in which every country, it doesn't matter how small you are, you have a voice. And that is very critical to solve a global climate challenge. If we give up on the whole enterprise, then what we're doing is actually reinforcing the power of the rich and the elite. Because these conversations will still happen. They will happen in venues that are closed door, not open to civil society participation, and they will happen in ways that just reinforce the current power structures and dynamics. So what we saw with loss and damage, it's a big win for climate justice. And the reason it is because the voices of the smallest nations, the most vulnerable, were centered in that outcome. It can happen. I know it sometimes feels like the odds are long, but those are precisely the moments that require all of us who care about climate justice to show up, put our shoulder to it. It was inspiring to see the united effort to get that loss and damage facility. And this is just the first step, of course. It's not the ultimate win, but this is the kind of diverse movement, justice-centered work that is needed to get the outcomes in venues like COP that every country has representation at.
Well, I want to go back to those three metrics that you had identified prior to the start of COP27. You said there were three things that you were looking for as metrics of success. And we've talked about number two, which was renewed scale up of finance pledges from richer countries. That wasn't addressed specifically in that way, but there was the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund. I'd like to talk about the other two and see what movement, if any, was made on that. Increased ambition of emissions reduction commitments and also meaningful progress on addressing climate loss and damage. Talk a little bit about that first one, the increased ambition of emissions reduction commitments. What was achieved or maybe what wasn't achieved?
Well, the thing about emissions reductions commitments are nations under the Paris Agreement are required to put forth commitments that they are making of their own accord for how much they will cut their emissions. There is no world government that's going to be able to force this in every country. So countries have to develop policies on their own in their domestic context and make these pledges. So, for example, the United States has committed to cutting its emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. Right now, some of the major policies that can help us get there include the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed this summer, and then forthcoming regulatory approaches, state policies, etc. But making sure that these commitments first of all, are robust and then backed up by domestic policy is the challenge. And right now, collectively, country commitments are falling well short of what it will take to stay below 1.5 C. The United Nations put out a report before COP that showed we're on track for 2.5 to 2.8 C at the current, if the current commitments are fulfilled, which is just not enough. And at this COP, we did not see a huge surge to ratchet up the ambition of these commitments. So that's definitely a problem. And there were some bright spots. There is a global methane pledge that over 100 countries have now committed to collectively cutting global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And that's big because methane is a very potent heat trapping gas, and emissions of methane are on the rise globally. So that there are some bright spots like that, but overall what we're continuing to see is this extraordinary build out of fossil fuels, and that is completely incompatible with a climate safe future. And that points out the challenge of disrupting the power of the fossil fuel industry, because they have used, for example, this unjust war on Ukraine, they have used it cynically to perpetuate more fossil fuel infrastructure. That is a dead end. That is very short-sighted thinking. If anything, this is a reminder that we need to accelerate our transition to clean energy, build transmission that will enable more clean energy to come online, invest in energy storage. We have these solutions, and we didn't hear enough of that at this COP. One really major failing at this COP was that we wanted to secure language that would require a global phase down of all fossil fuels. Last year in Glasgow, we secured language that just spoke to the phase down of unabated coal. But obviously, it's not just coal. We need to go after natural gas, oil, and that language India had put forward in the first week of COP. But unfortunately, it was not taken up in a serious way. There was obstruction from Russia, from Saudi Arabia, and others objecting to that language. And frankly, the United States and the European Union nations never really went to the mat for it and force a fight around this. And so that was very disappointing.
So what happens then when you have these fossil fuel producing countries, you mentioned there, Russia, Saudi Arabia, they're the ones who are obstructing. And it's not even a phasing out. It was, as you said, phasing down. That's what India had been calling for. So when you have that power of these countries that are so reliant, and their entire economy is so reliant on fossil fuel production, leading to no movement forward when it comes to emissions reduction. I mean, how do we move forward then globally when that is the dynamic that's currently at play?
Well, I would say two things about that. It's really important in this context to isolate and shame countries that are blocking progress. And we did not see that happen. We know that Russia and Saudi Arabia were objecting to this behind the scenes, but they needed to have been called out on the floor publicly on this global stage and really be isolated in that position. The other thing is, just because we did not secure agreement in the text does not mean that countries can't move on this path on their own. So the United States doesn't need permission from the UNFCCC to do the obvious, to align its policies with the science. The EU nations do not need permission from the United Nations to know that what's best for them going forward is a rapid transition to clean energy. And that's why it's a bit of it's a bit hypocritical to say because we didn't secure agreement, we can't get progress. Everyone knows what the science shows. Everyone knows what needs to be done. And so implementing those policies and moving forward can actually then create greater pressure on the global community. Because right now, the renewable energy industry is a huge opportunity. And the more countries that make these switches to electric vehicles, to ramping up solar and wind and offshore wind, the more we get that synergy across the world that the International Energy Agency and others have been pointing out is critical to shifting financial flows away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And finally, not within the UNFCCC context, but alongside it, there's a big move now towards climate litigation to hold fossil fuel companies accountable in courts for the damage that their product is causing to communities around the world. And I think that's really important to watch, because if the UN system is starting to fall short on this front, that pressure for litigation is only going to grow.
Well, in the last few minutes that we have, Rachel, the name of the show is Just Solutions, and we do try to focus at least part of the show on what solutions are emerging. And you mentioned there that issue of climate litigation, and we have certainly discussed that. And that is certainly something we are seeing happening at a grassroots level, right? Communities themselves taking ownership in this way. What are some solutions, or what are some next steps that the Union of Concerned Scientists, what are you calling for? What can be done? Let's look at a policy level here in the US as we're about to start a new legislative session, not just, federally, but also we'll have state legislators reconvening in the coming weeks as we start the new year. What can be done and what needs to be done and what realistically can be done here?
Well, here in the United States, we're fighting for a robust implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act so that we use that opportunity to get as much renewables online as possible and to make sure that our investments are benefiting the communities that have borne the brunt of fossil fuel emissions and have been sidelined in the progress to clean energy. So that's one big part of the fight. We're also going to be fighting for strong regulations, carbon pollution standards for power plants and vehicles, for example, state policies to further the momentum to clean energy, and climate resilience. It's really, really important to push for these investments. We haven't yet secured them in the United States. And right now, we're fighting, as I said, for international climate finance in the budget that the United States Congress will be appropriating. It's critical that we meet our global climate commitments. The other piece we do in solidarity with civil society groups around the world. One campaign that really caught my attention was the Don't Gas Africa campaign that a number of civil society groups in Africa have launched. And that campaign's sole goal is to help Africa jumpstart into clean energy and not get sidetracked by this expansion of gas that's being forced, frankly, by the energy crisis in Europe, where they are increasingly turning to other places to get gas now. And these civil society advocates are fighting a tough fight with great integrity and with justice centered. It's really important for all of us around the world to pay attention because they're pointing to solutions and help buttress these kinds of campaigns from our home countries as well.
And just briefly, the loss and damage fund that was agreed upon at COP27, you said that is as of yet unfunded. How can people globally pay attention to that, to keep pressure on, to make sure that richer countries like the US will fulfill their commitments to that very important fund?
Yeah, so with that loss and damage fund, there is now a year-long process to help get it operational. We're pushing hard for civil society to have representation in that committee and have it be transparent, make sure that that fund is operationalized as soon as possible, and that our countries are contributing to it. This, as you said, is not aid. It is what we owe because this loss and damage is being imposed by emissions from richer countries. It's their responsibility. And making sure that people in our countries understand that responsibility and are pushing policymakers to put funding on the table is going to be the critical next step in this campaign to operationalize a loss and damage fund.
Well, Rachel Cleetus with the Union of Concerned Scientists, thank you so much for being our guest on Just Solutions.
Thank you so much for having me.
And don't forget that Just Solutions is also available as a podcast, so you can listen anytime. Just subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and never miss an episode. And you can watch past episodes online at freespeech.org. From all of us at Free Speech TV, thank you so much for joining us this week on Just Solutions.